Waking at 3 a.m. triples fatigue and brain fog after 60. But here's the shocking truth. Removing one category of food after dinner can calm the nervous system in just days, not months. In my years caring for adults over 60, I've seen this pattern repeat endlessly. People fall asleep just fine, sometimes even easily, and then, almost predictably, they wake around 2:30 or 3 a.m. Their mind feels alert, their heart slightly faster, their body restless. They aren't anxious about anything specific, yet sleep refuses to return. This is not bad luck, it is physiology. And most of the time, it starts many hours earlier than you think, often with what you ate or drank after mid-afternoon. What surprises most people is not that caffeine affects sleep, but how long it stays in the system after 60. Earlier in life, the body handled stimulants efficiently, clearing them before nightfall with little consequence. With age, that clearance slows quietly, almost invisibly. The result is that something consumed at noon or 2 in the afternoon can still be influencing the brain when the house is dark and silent. This is where many 3 a.m. awakenings begin, not at bedtime, but hours earlier when the nervous system was unknowingly primed to stay alert. Caffeine works by blocking adenosine, the chemical that builds up during the day and creates sleep pressure at night. In younger bodies, that blockade fades relatively quickly. In older adults, it lingers. The brain may fall asleep initially, but it never fully settles into the deep, stable rhythms that keep sleep intact. Instead, it hovers closer to wakefulness, making it vulnerable to early morning arousal. Around 3 a.m., when sleep naturally becomes lighter, that lingering stimulation has its opening. The effect is subtle enough that it rarely raises suspicion. An afternoon coffee feels harmless. A cup of tea seems gentle. A square of dark chocolate appears almost virtuous. Yet in the aging brain, these stimulants behave less like a brief spark and more like a low-burning pilot light. The light is easy to ignore, but it keeps the brain from fully powering down. At night, that persistent glow translates into alertness at precisely the wrong time. I remember a woman in her early 70s who described her nights as mysteriously predictable. She fell asleep without effort, sometimes within minutes, and then woke almost every night just before 3 a.m., fully conscious and mildly frustrated. There was no anxiety, no pain, no racing thoughts. Only after a careful review of her afternoons did a pattern emerge: a ritual cup of tea at 4 o'clock and a small piece of chocolate in the evening. Nothing excessive, nothing dramatic. Yet once those were removed from the later hours of her day, the awakenings gradually faded. The brain at night behaves much like a darkened house with a single porch light left on. From the outside, everything appears calm. Inside, however, that light is enough to signal activity, enough to keep certain systems from fully resting. Caffeine, including the hidden forms found in chocolate, cola, and many teas, plays that role remarkably well. It does not shout, it whispers, and the aging nervous system hears whispers much more clearly than it used to. What makes this particularly challenging is that caffeine often stops producing obvious sensations. There may be no jitters, no racing heart, no sense of stimulation at all. The body feels calm, yet the chemistry underneath tells a different story. Sleep becomes lighter, more fragmented and less resilient. When the early morning hours arrive, the brain simply does what it has been biochemically encouraged to do all along: wake up. For many older adults, recognizing this connection is the first major turning point, not because caffeine is inherently harmful, but because timing becomes everything with age. The same substance that once caused no trouble can quietly reshape sleep architecture decades later. When this is understood, the frustration around 3 a.m. wake-ups often begins to dissolve. The body was not rebelling. It was responding predictably to a signal that overstayed its welcome. If these 3 a.m. wake-ups are finally making sense, subscribe here. Each week we expose the quiet signals aging bodies send at night, so you can sleep longer, think clearer, and wake up steadier. There is a quiet misunderstanding about sleep that becomes especially powerful after 60. The belief that what helps you fall asleep must also help you stay asleep. Alcohol and heavy evening meals fit perfectly into this illusion. They create an initial sense of relaxation, even drowsiness, giving the impression that the night is off to a good start. Yet beneath that surface calm, a very different biological story is unfolding, one that often reaches its climax between 2 and 4 in the morning. Alcohol has a well-documented sedative effect early in the night. It slows brain activity, softens tension, and can make falling asleep feel effortless. But sedation is not the same as restoration. As alcohol is metabolized, it disrupts the architecture of sleep, suppressing REM and deep stages that the aging brain already struggles to maintain. Several hours later, as blood alcohol levels drop, the nervous system rebounds. Stress hormones rise. The brain shifts into a lighter, more vigilant state. Sleep fragments and awakening becomes far more likely. Sugar and refined carbohydrates amplify this effect in a different but equally disruptive way. Large dinners, especially those heavy in starches or desserts, create sharp rises in blood glucose. The body responds with insulin, pushing sugar into cells. In younger systems, this process is smooth. With age, it becomes uneven. Blood sugar can drop too low in the early morning hours, triggering a cortisol response designed to protect the brain. Cortisol does its job well, but it is not a sleep-friendly hormone. When it rises at 3 a.m., the brain wakes. This is why so many older adults describe a very specific pattern: falling asleep quickly after dinner or a nightcap, then waking suddenly, alert but not panicked, often with a subtle sense of internal activation. The body feels as if it has flipped a switch. This is not psychological. It is metabolic. The nervous system is responding to chemical instability created hours earlier at the dinner table. A man in his late 60s once described his evenings as his favorite part of the day. A generous dinner, a glass or two of wine and something sweet to finish. Sleep came easily, almost immediately, yet night after night he found himself awake in the early morning, mind clear, body restless. When those evenings were simplified, the awakenings gradually lost their grip. Nothing dramatic changed. The internal chemistry simply stopped swinging so wildly. The image that best captures this process is a swing pushed too hard. At first, the ride feels exhilarating, even pleasant. But the higher it goes, the more violent the return. Alcohol, sugar, and oversized late meals push the nervous system upward into an artificial calm. The snapback comes later, when sleep is at its most fragile. That snap is often what opens the eyes at 3 a.m. What makes this especially relevant after 60 is the narrowing margin for error. The aging body becomes less tolerant of extremes, particularly in the evening. Digestive demands, blood sugar shifts, and liver metabolism all compete with the brain's need for stability during sleep. When that balance is lost, the night pays the price. These awakenings are not signs of weakness or lack of discipline. They are signals that the internal environment became too turbulent for deep sleep to survive. Understanding this dynamic often reframes years of frustration. The issue was never an inability to sleep. It was the collision between evening chemistry and nighttime physiology. Once that collision is recognized, the pattern of early awakenings begins to make sense, not as a mystery, but as a predictable consequence of how the aging body processes alcohol, sugar, and volume after the sun goes down. For many people over 60, nighttime awakenings are blamed on the bladder, aging digestion, or an unavoidable sensitivity that comes with time. The assumption is that the body is simply wearing out. Yet this explanation misses a quieter and far more accurate truth. In countless cases, the body is not failing at all. It is reacting to irritation, small, persistent signals that disrupt sleep from the inside long after dinner is over. Spicy, acidic, and high-fat foods tend to linger in the digestive system, particularly as gastric emptying slows with age. When the body lies down, these foods increase the likelihood of nighttime reflux, even when heartburn is not consciously felt. Acid or pressure rising in the esophagus does not always cause pain, but it does activate the nervous system. Micro-arousals occur. Sleep becomes lighter. Eventually, one of those arousals crosses the threshold into full wakefulness, often in the early morning hours when sleep is already fragile. Salt introduces a different but equally disruptive pathway. Highly processed or salty foods increase thirst and fluid shifts in the body. During the night, this can translate into increased urine production, known as nocturia. The bladder fills more quickly, signaling the brain to wake. What feels like a bladder problem is often a sodium problem that began at dinner. The awakening itself becomes the focus while the cause remains invisible. I recall a woman in her mid-70s who believed her sleep was permanently broken. She woke every night, needing the bathroom, usually around the same early morning hour. She had accepted this as normal aging. Over time, however, a pattern emerged. On evenings when her meals were heavier, saltier, or spicier, the awakenings were almost guaranteed. On simpler nights, sleep was noticeably more stable. Her body was not betraying her. It was responding consistently to irritation it could no longer compensate for silently. The effect of these foods is often underestimated because the reaction is delayed. There is no immediate discomfort. Dinner feels enjoyable, digestion seems fine, and bedtime arrives without issue. Hours later, however, the cumulative irritation reaches the nervous system. Sleep, which depends on calm, predictability, and low sensory input, begins to fracture. The brain interprets internal discomfort as a reason to stay alert, even if the conscious mind does not recognize the source. The image that fits best here is sand in machinery. Each grain seems insignificant on its own. Yet over time, friction builds, movement becomes rough, and eventually the system stalls. Spicy sauces, fried foods, citrus-heavy dishes, carbonation, and excess sodium act in much the same way. They introduce friction into a system that, after 60, requires more gentleness than it once did. What makes this realization so powerful is how often these awakenings have been misattributed. Many people resign themselves to poor sleep, believing their body has crossed an irreversible line. In reality, the night is being interrupted by signals the brain was never meant to ignore. When irritation is present, even at low levels, deep sleep cannot fully protect itself. The result is awakening, not because sleep is weak, but because the body is vigilant. Once this connection is understood, the experience of waking at 3 a.m. begins to look very different. It is no longer a random event or a personal shortcoming. It is the body responding intelligently to irritation it can no longer buffer in silence. That awareness alone often brings relief because it restores a sense of logic to a problem that once felt arbitrary and unsolvable. There is a perspective often associated with Mark Hyman that becomes especially meaningful after 60. Food is not just fuel, it is information. Nowhere is that more true than in the evening. What enters the body in the hours before sleep does not simply sit in the stomach. It sends instructions to hormones, nerves, blood sugar regulators, and the brain itself. By the time the clock reaches 3 a.m., those instructions are either supporting deep repair or quietly pulling the system out of it. When sleep fragments night after night, it is tempting to search for a single cause or a single fix, yet the pattern you've just seen reveals something more nuanced. Early morning awakenings are rarely about one dramatic error. They emerge from accumulation, stimulants that linger, blood sugar swings that rebound, digestion that irritates instead of settling, sodium that shifts fluid balance at the wrong hour. None of these feel urgent in the moment. Together, they shape the night. What becomes clear is that better sleep is not about forcing the body into unconsciousness. It is about creating conditions where sleep can protect itself. The aging body is not fragile, but it is more honest. It responds quickly to instability and rewards consistency. When evenings become calmer on a biochemical level, the night often follows with surprising cooperation. This is why pills so often disappoint. They override signals instead of resolving them. They may knock the brain out temporarily, but they do nothing to steady blood sugar at 3 a.m., quiet reflux, or ease the nervous system's vigilance. True restoration comes from alignment, not suppression. When the internal environment is stable, sleep no longer has to fight for survival. The emotional impact of this shift can be profound. Deeper sleep restores more than energy. Mood steadies, memory sharpens, immunity strengthens. The day feels less heavy, less reactive. Many people describe a subtle return of resilience, as if their body remembers how to recover again. This is not a reversal of age, it is the removal of unnecessary interference. Perhaps the most important realization is this: nothing you've experienced suggests that your body is broken. The awakenings were signals, not verdicts. They were messages delivered at the quietest hour, when the body finally had your attention. Once those messages are understood, the night often becomes an ally again, rather than a battleground. Protecting sleep is not about perfection. It is about intention. When evenings are designed with the same care once reserved for medication schedules, sleep regains its power to heal. And when nights are protected, days begin to feel lighter, steadier, and often, to people's surprise, noticeably younger.